Welcome to Chelsea's Vocation. Chelsea raised two children on the autism spectrum, Justus and Noey, into adulthood. They're the reason why she can't help but smile when she recognizes autism in another human, especially a child. Chelsea spent almost 2 decades studying this neurotype as a parent professional, learning how to better adapt her own behavior and the environment around autistic children to both encourage and foster their development. She hopes through this podcast that you might better understand how neurotypical people process your neurology if you're autistic, or how to better yourself as someone who values autistic humans and your relationship with them. Chelsea is a lifelong learner and expects you are too. So don't hesitate to reach out to her through social media comments or the contact form on our website with your own insights. If you're coming to this podcast after the first 5 episodes, you may want to go to the show and review one or more of those foundational episodes to know where she's coming from. Either way, we're glad you're here now.
Autism is so often explained pathologically as primarily a social communication disorder. As pithy as that descriptor is, it's packed with meaning, both outlined in the DSM-5 criteria and implied in functional applications. The social includes a component of relationship. If an autistic person is by themselves, there's no sign of a communication struggle. But put that person with another human, particularly one considered neurotypical, and differences in communication are often apparent. This was certainly true of my son, Justus. Now 26 as a preschooler, Justus might have been considered functionally nonverbal. He certainly had receptive language, meaning he could understand much of what the folks around him were saying, and communicative intent, which sounded much like his own indecipherable language at that age. But it was enormously frustrating for both parties in a social exchange. Lacking a way to communicate effectively will logically lead to other attempts to communicate needs and preferences. More specifically for autistic children, this is often expressed behaviorally. It's why I so often say to allistic folks leaning into their curiosity about their neurospicy loved ones, all behavior is communication. I am delighted that as we understand alternative methods of communicating, we've moved away from the term nonverbal to a more accurate non-speaking as a descriptor for our neurospicy loved ones. It helps us to presume competence. In other words, just because a person hasn't figured out how to tell you what they're definitely thinking. They have ideas and preferences and feelings just like anyone else. They might not be able to convey those things to you in words yet, but that doesn't make them any less intelligent. As Justus got older, I learned how to do better as a parent in reading his cues, and he added spoken language I could understand to his vocabulary. But the interesting part about that is Justus was using scripts from TV shows and movies to communicate. Eventually, I had a light bulb moment at a conference when a speech pathologist was talking about Gestalt language processing. That's Justus. And I realized that he wasn't just a Gestalt language processor, or GLP, but he processed all information as a whole rather than in pieces. When your loved one has a great support person, it changes everything. When Trisha Sikarsky joined my kids' team as a speech-language pathologist in elementary school, I felt seen and heard as a parent, and I knew my learners would have a champion in their building. This is why it gives me great pleasure to welcome Trisha to the podcast to discuss this topic of language development and autism. Thanks for being here, Trisha.
It is my pleasure.
Obviously, I'm very interested in this concept of Gestalt learning. So please explain the difference between Gestalt and analytic language processing as forms of natural language acquisition.
Absolutely, Chelsea. So Gestalt language processing is a way of learning language that involves understanding larger chunks of language or gestalts before breaking them down into smaller parts. For instance, understanding let's go home as a whole unit versus the understanding of what go is individually and then applying it to home as a noun. Analytic language, it's what we think of how people learn language best. So you learn one word that would be home or the word dog, and then you slowly combine other words to form larger chunks of language. So you learn dog, And then you learn dog eats, dog sleeps, dog runs. Now, Gestalt language processing is actually very common among children with autism. There are some simple signs that many people can look for in those early learners. For instance, using that scripted language, that's one major indicator that your child might be a Gestalt language processor. However, it's not as uncommon as you think it is. About 50% of typically developing children are also Gestalt language processors, as opposed to that 75 to 90% of children on that autism spectrum. I think it's really important, though, to be very cautious about some of those statistics because one can never really know how a child learns language. They can't communicate that to you. So all of the information and all of the research that's been done, it's based on observation, life experience, and understanding of the different types of language developing processes. You have to be very careful on how you interpret that.
I didn't have the language to put with Gestalt language processing when I was noticing this about Justus.
Correct.
But the first kind of indications for me that that's how he was thinking is that when he wanted to play with me, for example, he would reenact something from a movie. So back in the day, it was Monsters, Inc. So he opens the bathroom door and he jumps out and he says, "Boo," to me. And I'm like, oh, he's playing like Boo from Monsters, Inc. This is how he's inviting me into play. He's just taking things that he's seeing and using them contextually to communicate his wants, preferences, feelings.
Yes, and understanding that is much more complex and difficult than understanding dog runs, dog sleeps. It's easy to interpret. It's kind of universally known. But when you're parroting things or you're using that scripted language from a video to apply it to new meaning, that's where it becomes a lot more difficult. I also used to have a student who would say the jingle from the McDonald's commercial over and over. And what it really just meant is he's hungry. He wants a snack. It makes sense now, but boy, there were many days where he was frustrated. I was frustrated. We were all frustrated trying to figure out what that meant. But once you figure it out, it's unlocking a ton of communication for that child. Now you start to apply, well, when they use that script, what do you think that means? It makes a lot more sense.
You almost have to become a detective in this situation.
Absolutely.
I think about Benedict Cumberbatch's role in Sherlock Holmes all the time. And I was like, this is how you have to parent. And clearly, this is how you have to be a speechy. And this is how you have to be an educator.
Yeah.
You have to lean into your curiosity about your kid and understand that they're not doing stuff for no reason.
No, and you know there's a reason when it's done more than once. When there's something that is just said one time in a situation and you don't hear it again, maybe it just reminded them of something. When they're using that same phrase or group of words over and over, you know that there's implied meaning there. I think this is what started me early on in my true crime interests and puzzling and all of those other fun things because I like that challenge. I like figuring out something no one else figured out, and it makes such a huge impact on the lives of these children.
That, I think, is the coolest part of that relationship building, right? Is the look on their face when they know that you got it.
Absolutely.
And now you've built this rapport. There's some trust there. They're more willing to say, okay, now that we're both speaking the same language, so to speak, like, let's go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's then too, Chelsea, that you get more eye contact because they look for you like, you're going to get this. I'm going to say this and then you're going to get this. And I will often say, I hear what you're telling me. I can't figure it out. Let me work on this for a little bit. It makes a huge difference. And again, that relationship building.
And that brings me back to why it's so awesome to have these conversations with the autistic community, because they're the ones who coined the term the double empathy problem. And I think when it comes to communication, nowhere does that apply more. When we're trying to say you have to communicate the way we're used to communicating, this is the way that we understand you intelligently, that couldn't be more incorrect. But then the realization, the willingness to connect and trust when they understand you get it.
It's often what they refer to in my school now as the magic. They're like, Mrs. Sikarsky, you have magic. I said, no, I don't. I just figured it out. So it's when you have a child who's on that verge of getting really frustrated, melting down, they're getting more and more dysregulated because you're not getting it. When you take that second to step back and look at what's happening in the environment, and I say, oh, it's the noise in the hall, right? I mean, that's really bothering you today. Not every day, but today it's really bothering you. And you see them re-regulate. They're like, oh, you have magic. No, I just have really good observational skills.
Another thing that was really making me curious in this language development space is apraxia. As other people have listened to the podcast, they might have heard so many parents coming on and saying the first thing their kid was diagnosed with was apraxia of speech.
Yeah.
And as I know about the motor problems, both gross and fine, that my kids had, I started to think more about apraxia and just motor in general. So can you talk a little bit about how the motor functions of spoken language might impact an autistic child's ability to communicate?
Absolutely. I don't know if many people understand or know that all motor planning comes from the same place in the cerebral cortex. So it's all housed in the same area. Spoken language is really very, very complex. We take it for granted. We see something, we identify it as a dog, we understand it, we think it in our head. Our brain is already sending messages to move my tongue in the position for a D. I need some voice on that. I need to then pull my tongue back to make an O. I need a different shape of my mouth. Then I need that G, which is a velar sound in the back. Again, keep that voice on the whole time. And in order to put all those things together and then to be able to identify verbally what I see is an incredibly complex mechanism in itself. At any point, one message, one neuron going the wrong way or not completing that pathway, and we get a whole different word. We get a dod versus a dog, or we don't get any voicing, and now we have like a word that is undetermined, right? So apraxia is just that. And we know lots of history, lots of research talks about all of the motor planning issues that are related to our children on the autism spectrum. They have fine motor difficulties, manipulating things across midway. They have a lot of difficulties with coordinating different gross motor components and body parts. And that fine motor in your mouth is no different. What is interesting, and as I did some research, I was looking up some statistics because I knew in my practice it happens often. I mean, I would say more than often, I would say frequently. I have a child on the autism spectrum who is also having some motor component specifically related to speech and language. And so I started doing some research on that. And I was flabbergasted actually to figure out that in 2015, now this is 10 years ago already, Penn State was already indicating that 63.6% of kids initially diagnosed with autism also had apraxia. 63%. And that was 15 years ago. I was surprised to hear that number as high as it was. But then I wasn't, because I see it all of the time. Oftentimes it's not the understanding, because you can present 3 or 4 words or items, pictures to a child, and they indicate, hey, find the dog, and they'll find the dog. It wasn't that component. It was then let's try to say these things. And then we would get behavior, and I'm giving air quotes to that because then they would break down. They would become frustrated. They might be crying. They might be pushing away. And it was, oh, it's the words that are hard. Well, it wasn't just the words. It was the whole planning piece of that. What can we do to help bridge that divide between I know what I want to say, I can't get it all out, I can't even get it close to something that you'd be able to identify. So I'm just going to be frustrated here because I have things to say. What can we do to alleviate some of that?
Justus's younger sibling, Noey, had plenty of words, a huge vocabulary, which was so different. It was honestly one of the reasons that I was confused that Noey was being considered for an autism diagnosis to begin with, because in my brain, the social communication part was a big struggle. Now, Noey had different struggles with language, as you well know.
Yes.
Some of those things included really interesting word swaps. So for picture, Noey would say mirror. For window, Noey would say frame. Just like conceptually it was there, but the word wasn't quite right. Or a word might sound similar. So for a headband, Noey would say a band-aid. Just really cute things like that. Quirky would add extra past participle to every verb. I run-did, I jumped-did. And I know these were things you all worked on.
Something along those same lines. Things like when you use the word band-aid for headband, That's an apraxia in itself. We don't often see that. We think motor planning, if you can't get the B, you say D for a B or you say an M for a B, that's what apraxia is. It's the sounds in the purest form and then the combination of them. It's not. It's also the syllables and the sequencing of the syllables of the words that we have. So when we often think about, that makes sense. Band-Aid and headband, they're very semantically similar. It's not just a pure sound and combining those sounds. Sometimes it's syllables, sometimes it's the word sequence in a sentence as well.
All right, we touched just like the tiniest little bit on AAC. Reframing this, my kids old, they're grown. AAC in the beginning was an absolute no-no. In the field of having the research, the data, the statistics, the studies, it wasn't there. And the first time I saw it in practice, I was at a fantastic conference called Augmentative that moves all around the country. And this autism conference happened to be in Wisconsin that year. I want to say that's 2008. But I was attending a breakout. And keep in mind, this is a conference by autistic people for autistic people. So I was there as a minority holistic observer, just leaning into my own curiosity and ready to learn from the autistic community. I saw on the breakout session, there was a panel on legislative advocacy. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting because that's something I'm trying to do as a parent, is advocate on my kids' behalf. And when I walk into the room, which was packed, there were autistic people, 5 people on the panel at the front of the room, and several of them, I think 3 of the 5, had people who were facilitating their communication. None of them used spoken language the way I was used to it. All of them were typing to speak. Most of those who had assistance with the motor planning parts of using a communication device also had a lot of vocal stims and a lot of physical stims. So there was this huge cognitive dissonance in me looking at these people and having the things coming out of their devices that were coming out of their devices. But there was no doubt in my mind that this was authentic and that this was real. And then it just made me really sad for every kid who didn't know how to do that yet, who wasn't exposed to that technology yet. So I want you to just kind of talk a little bit about what AAC is, because it's huge. It's a lot more than just devices, and it's a lot more than typing to speak at all. So if you'll talk about AAC a little bit, and then how this has evolved since you've been a speechy.
It's a big question because I've been doing speech and language therapy for 24 years. And I'll be very honest, I had very little graduate school training in alternative forms of communication. And that I did have was very basic, focused more on pictures, using like a PEX system, which is a picture communication exchange. There was a little bit on one of the big, most well-known AAC industries, which is Tobii Dynavox. 2 things I knew about AAC at that time, 25 years ago, was number 1, it was all or none. If you were going to go an AAC or use some kind of alternative augmented communication, that's what you were focusing on, and you were not focusing on verbal communication as well. And number 2, you better have deep pockets because it is incredibly expensive and you really need to have some kind of backup, because when those devices would break, it could be months before you could get them repaired because it wasn't as common, it wasn't as prevalent, and it wasn't as centrally located. So what it is an alternative form of communication that can either take the place of or augment verbal communication. So it can be something like pictures, but it can also be things that are low tech. There are little devices that are single buttons that you have, say, one verbal output message. It could be a yes, it could be I want that, it could be stop or go. It's usually something very, very basic. It can become a little bit more complex where it might be a 9 picture button array that you could put 9 different things. You could have 3 layers of 9 different messages. And then as it moved and progressed, it could become something more like a Proloco to Go, TD Snap on Tobii Dynavox, which is a multi-layered system of connected categorical vocabulary that you can change, that is very responsive to what you need. So it can go from very simplistic to very complex, and it can be personalized. It's come a very, very long way. Unfortunately, the technology world is advancing faster than I think our human world is evolving. And now we have things like iPads, which used to be more expensive, and now they're a dime a dozen. If something's not working, you buy a new one because it's that inexpensive. And there are apps that you can put on. If you were going to use a device like that, you were not focusing on the verbal communication, which was a big turnoff for a lot of people. Parents would say, I want to hear my child speak. And you're saying that they're never going to speak. And it's not like that anymore. I can't tell you how many personal students I have where it is such a combination. We are working very slowly on those sounds, on vowels, on consonants, how to combine them. It's really a combination, and knowing that you need both, but it's not enough to know that. You have to model that and show that to many, many people over and over. So it's a lot of teaching and a lot of modeling for people how to combine the two forms, how to encourage and expect some verbal communication, while also providing the opportunity to use their AAC for those things that maybe they can't verbally communicate at this point.
I feel like for such a long time, the only valid form of communication was spoken language.
Absolutely.
As neurotypical parents, I think that was the gold standard. And that grieves me to see parents kind of insisting, and I am just as guilty. It's kind of why I do this podcast, of making all these mistakes, these use your words.
Yes.
And they're trying, they can't at this point. So being able to acknowledge that using a device or having them make a gesture or having them point to a picture is just as valid a form of communication. Because as you said, they're just not there yet. They may very well get there. And if they never get there to spoken language, whatever they use to communicate is still totally valid.
Absolutely. And just because they can't say the word doesn't mean they don't understand the word and that they don't have something to share. And I know we've talked a lot about that presumed competence. Everyone has interests and likes and dislikes. They have feelings and emotions, and they have ways of wanting to communicate those. Maybe it's not mainstream. Maybe it's not, as socially as acceptable as the verbal spoken language, or as easy, right? It's not as easy for us to understand what they're trying to communicate. It takes a little more work. Well, it's taking a lot of work for those children to communicate even the most simple of feelings or wants or desires. And so it's only kind for us to put in a little bit of work too, to figure that out.
Well, I think just like you said, as we learn better, as we know better, we're going to do better. And that's going to help our kids be the best versions of themselves they can be. And ultimately, that's all that matters.
Absolutely.
Not what we expected them to become. It's all about who they are and helping them find that becoming together as a team and supporting that process.
It might be outside of what we, social constraints of what we've found to be acceptable, but it's not really. It's just a different way.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Chelsea's Vocation. We hope it was valuable to you. If it was, we'd appreciate you sharing it with someone, reviewing it, and/or rating it. Subscribe to the podcast to be notified when new episodes are published. We wish you the best as you learn, maybe unlearn, and do better for yourself and those around you. Chelsea encourages you to be gentle with yourself, be gracious with others, and be protective of your own and others' dignity. Until next time, take care.